So we are happy to welcome Kathy Pearson to the Conference for Heads of Schools here at Mohonk Mountain House. And having heard your extraordinary talk on making decisions and the importance of a good strategy for making decisions, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. But first, just say a little bit about your background, just a couple of sentences.
Yeah, thank you for having me at this lovely location, by the way. So I'm Kathy Pearson, taught at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania for many years. I have my own firm now. My background is engineering with a concentration in statistics, but really I think of myself as a decision scientist, so both from the quantitative analytical side, but also from the cognitive side. So this is why it intersects now with strategy, because both those sides are needed.
That's wonderful. So what trends are you seeing in schools? I know you've started to work with schools a little more than you had before. What trends are you seeing in schools regarding the kinds of decisions that schools are having to make?
Yeah, so at least the schools with which I've worked so far, the independent schools, a lot of discussion about the cost pressure, that tuition needs to go up. We have to make a value proposition more succinctly and more seriously, that parents are starting to put more pressure on that. So that's number one. Some of the boarding schools with which I've worked have said, listen, our international community we have some issues around there, so we have to make some decisions on how to handle that, looking for the revenue streams and how we really continue to bring education to these kids in a way that both honors our tradition but is also adaptable.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And of course, it varies from state to state, I'm sure, and so forth.
Also the different kinds of schools. I found
yes.
out, that I found, as a parent I knew this, but I really know it now, seeing different types of independent schools. That's, you have 6 independent schools and you have 6 different schools, right? So not only how they value education, how they define education, but really what their persona is.
Mm-hmm. So that's what makes them so independent.
Exactly.
So why do you think effective decision-making is so difficult?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I think that there are all sorts of psychological reasons why we struggle with decision-making, especially when it's complex. Number one, we as humans really are not thrilled with uncertainty, and our world is increasingly uncertain. As you know, my talk had the word VUCA in it, this new corporate buzzword that means volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Someone came up to me before I talked and said, what does VUCA mean? I've not heard that yet. And when I said it, she said, oh, I get it. That's exactly right. And so I think, we as humans, we just like certainty. So we're risk averse in that regard. And then it's just increasing. So it's harder and harder to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future.
So how can we improve the probability of a good outcome when we are making a decision?
That's great question. As I mentioned today in my talk, I have a colleague, Cade Massey, who's at Wharton, who studies the role of what he calls chance in decision making. And he has this continuum that I think is really interesting, all the way from a decision and its outcome completely on chance versus completely on your skill, decision-making skill. Most decisions are in the middle. Some of it's stuff that you can't control, and some of it's our decision-making skill. If you have uncertainty, you cannot guarantee a good outcome. So that's number one. So how do we raise the probability, which is your question? Well, we can raise our decision-making skill set. We can, adopt certain behaviors that raise that probability. And then this lever on my right, on your left, uncertainty, this is where we have to manage uncertainty, and I tell senior leaders all the time, it's not about our ability to predict accurately about the future. It's about our ability to manage that uncertainty as we continue to execute on our decisions. So those are 2 different skill sets, and I touched on both of those today, actually.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That was very interesting. You also said that diverse groups make better decisions. And I wonder if you can explain that a little bit.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
So, it sure is a lot easier if we have a whole bunch of people that think like us. We can make decisions much more quickly and efficiently, but they aren't as effective. There's an interesting study. I've tried to be succinct in explaining it, and it was reported in the Atlantic a couple of years ago. Some researchers were interested in what makes a successful Broadway play team. So building Broadway plays, producers, directors, et cetera. And they had what they called a Q factor that measured basically the relationship between the team members. Had they worked together, extensively in the past, or did they not know each other at all? And so once again, they had this continuum of, hey, people who've worked together for years and years and years as an intact team versus all the way to the other end, which is 5 people who never even met each other and they're coming together. And their metric of success for Broadway plays was how many days the play ran. So it wasn't revenue, it was, I think, on the number of days that the play stayed in the theaters. And they found that much closer to a team that doesn't know one another than the intact team. Because what happens is intact teams start thinking alike. And they have the same experiences. And the creativity goes down. Now, if you go to the very extreme where you have 5 people that don't know each other, there's a lot of learning that has to happen and you have to build trust. So that's not the most effective, but it's closer to that side than this side. That's just one of many, many, many studies that show that decisions made by heterogeneous groups are of higher quality because you're getting different perspectives. And no one of us has all this perspective we need, particularly for complex decisions.
So you used a term that I thought was interesting, and I hadn't heard it before, productive paranoia.
Yes,
Can you talk about that and why that's important?
Yeah, and by the way, I must credit Jim Collins, who wrote a book, Good to Great. He wrote Great by Choice, some other books. So that's actually his term, and I should have mentioned that in my talk. He actually came, that's the first time I've read it. He may have gotten that term from someone else. But it's this idea of we don't want to get too comfortable. When we've been really successful, particularly if we've been in existence for many years as an institution, it's easy to get comfortable. Paranoia says, hey, I'm always looking around the corner and, I'm always thinking that something's going to disrupt me. Productive paranoia says, hey, let's not make this, completely destructive, completely negative. Let's just be aware. I use the word vigilance as well, right? Let's just be vigilant, right? Continue. We're very successful, but we also know that change is all around us, and so we just want to be able to see leading indicators, not lagging indicators. The last thing you want to do is have to react because you're now seeing lagging indicators of change rather than leading indicators of change.
And so what do you mean by destructive paranoia?
Yeah, so I just think that, we all have folks in organizations that are always negative. No matter what's being suggested, they're going to have the contrarian view. And that's fine to have a devil's advocate, but what happens is, we all know this, if you have someone that no matter what meeting it is, no matter what you're discussing is always negative, then we tend to dismiss them after a while, right? It's like, oh, well, here comes Sally or Joe, they're going to disagree because that's what they do. And then you've completely missed their message. That to me is destructive paranoia. Not only is it not helping you be vigilant because you're ignoring it, but it's also sometimes destructive to the group dynamics, which is a whole other conversation.
You talked about the difference between a trend and an uncertainty. And can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and I should probably use different language because trends, often every organization talks about what are the trends in our industry. And they actually don't have necessarily giving it the nuance that I'm talking about. If you remember old Donald Rumsfeld one time, he said, we have known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And people kind of laughed at him, but he had a point. There are things we know are going to happen in the future. I happen to call those trends. You can call those predictables. You can call those known knowns. Things you know are going to happen. Tuition cost is going to continue to increase. We know that's going to happen. We may not know the rate, but we know it's going to happen. Uncertainty says, an unknown unknown is like a black swan, like something that just surprises us. The Zika virus for the Olympics in 2016. That was an unknown unknown. There was no way that they could have prepared for a mosquito-borne virus that gave birth defects, for example. But there are a lot of things we know we don't know, and we had that conversation today. I love the conversation about we know we're going to have non-traditional competitors in our space. That's a known known. But the known unknown is we have no idea what shape they'll be in. Will it be these online groups? Will it be, flipping the classroom in a different way? Will it be, right? And higher education, we talk a lot about what if the demand for degrees period goes away? What if it all becomes certificate programs, right? So there's all sorts of ways that we know it's going to be non-traditional competitors. We don't know who they are.
You also mentioned something called the faint light theory.
Yeah.
I wish you would explain that.
Yeah, so that happened. That was a term that was used in one of my clients, a big energy company, and the idea was, I want to look for early indicators. I want to see those faint lights. One of the things, and I'm not an artificial intelligence guru, so I may be speaking beyond my the boundaries, at the edge boundaries of my knowledge. But if you look at artificial intelligence, one of the last frontiers that's just really difficult for a machine to replicate in a human is our ability to see patterns that don't make any sense, right? That in fact, you know, we may not be able to tell, I may not be able to tell you what 27 times 432 is off the top of my head, but I can recognize different faces, 1,000 different faces differently, because I can, and so being able to replicate that is important. And so the idea of faint lights is, I'm going to look for all these early indicators and see, am I starting to see a pattern? And so that's the idea. Leading indicators, not lagging indicators, right? I want to be able to see when change is coming and be prepared to act on it before I have to react.
So do you have any last words? Is there anything you wish I had asked you that you might want to tell our viewers?
No, I just think that I think that it's a hopeful message in some ways. You know, we don't like uncertainty, but I think if we can think about it in terms, not in terms of how am I going to predict what's going to happen in 5 years, to I don't have to predict what's going to happen in 5 years. I actually have a structured approach to move forward. I'm going to identify what my uncertainties are. We're going to talk about how we're going to look for early indicators, and we're going to be ready to adapt. It's a hopeful message. It's a structured approach to managing uncertainty, as opposed to just, you know, almost just feeling helpless because we can't predict the future.
Well, that is a very hopeful message. So thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's been such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yep.